but it's hardly the only kind of trust that matters. We also know certainly that, well, certainly trust, by the way, seems to be more powerful than what media people actually consume. Since I teach in a journalism program, I got started with this area of research by being interested in how the media plays into all this, and the media are often blamed for amplifying some risks and attenuating others, and even that's kind of unpredictable. We don't understand fully how that's going to happen, although certainly a resonance with cultural concerns and the involvement of activist groups on one side of the spectrum and the other certainly has something to do with it. It seems a little bit unpredictable, but although patterns of trust are not the complete picture, they seem to be more important than actually what's in the media or patterns of media consumption. We also know that interpersonal communication does play a role. There's been quite a bit of research on that. Most recently, the study that I've been involved in, that's in the press and public understanding of science, has to do again with stem cells, because we had the data. What I have on nano is newer, but it shows that there's some indication that whether people talk to one another makes a difference, but it's very hard to see for the same reason that the influence of trust is hard to isolate. It depends who you're talking to, and it depends at what end of the positive or negative spectrum. So if you might be to begin with, it depends if you're highly religious, then the effect of interpersonal communication is different than if you're not. There's some evidence from the mass communication theory in our literature that interpersonal discussion should probably reinforce in many cases media messages, but for people who are at either end of the spectrum, in the case of stem cells, either very concerned about ethical issues or very accepting and not concerned at all, interpersonal communication doesn't seem to have the same effect. So it varies based on where in the spectrum of value and opinion you are to begin with. This means in sort of traditional regression or even SEM analysis, it's very hard to tease some of these influences out. But nanotechnology has really returned me to this notion of an expanded vocabulary of risk that I was starting to work with in the 1990s. This notion that risk is much fuzzier than we might suppose. That it also includes ethics, it includes benefits, it includes distributional issues. My colleague at John Vesley at the University of South Carolina, and of course many of you know Catherine McComas, who's now back at Cornell, have worked a lot with distributional justice and especially procedural justice. Do they feel that risks have been communicated in an open and fair way? This affects their response to the risk. I almost hesitate to use the word perception because it's kind of a loaded term, but certainly affects the acceptability of a risk, their more generalized response. And we're beginning to gather to get some data that suggests that distributional justice, although we haven't quite figured out how to measure that very well, John's working on it, but the distributional justice may be even more important. And some preliminary data, this is especially for Jennifer, I have some preliminary data that whether a risk is represented as regulated or not affects people's perception of risk. Anybody want to guess which way that goes? It doesn't go the way I would have necessarily expected it, although I had my suspicions. But it seems as though if we talk about a risk as being regulated, people see it as riskier rather than less risky. And that specifically is from data that we are developing, experimental data using news stories about nanotechnology. So, and then to this big category that I think is very important that much of our risk research simply ignores. If I persuaded you that risk is very fuzzy, even fuzzier than we've given it credit for. This category of social risks is fuzzier yet. But what seems to be emerging in my own data, primarily qualitative data, because these are things we're still learning how to measure, but I'm starting to develop some quantitative data on this as well. When you talk to people about nanotechnology, they bring up questions about what nanotechnology will mean for the economy, whether things will become more expensive, whether this will create jobs, or if it creates jobs within our own country, does this mean the jobs are going to go to me and my children, or will we have to go and be retrained for these jobs? What will it mean for distribution of benefits? If there is a new cure for cancer, is my insurance going to cover it? That's the sort of thing, even 4 years ago, people were bringing up in focus groups about nanotechnology. More recently, we've got about 100 interviews, 76 of them with people who are not college age, and another 33 or so that are from people who are college age. People have no notion whatsoever about what nanotechnology is. That started out as a mental modeling study, but people don't have mental models of nano. But they have a pretty good idea what they expect any technology to have, what I kind of call a template. They do expect there to be advantages and disadvantages and risks as well as benefits. They're not sure in the case of something like nanotechnology what that might be, but they have learned from other technologies to expect these things. One of the things that recurs specifically for nanotechnology that is interesting and a little bit puzzling is this privacy risk. People are concerned, and I don't actually know where this comes from. I know there are a couple of activist groups that are concerned about electronic surveillance that have sort of linked that to nanotechnology, but I'm not really thinking that most everyday people have been exposed to that. But for some reason, in other people's work as well as my own, this risk of privacy erosion, another social risk, seems to recur. It's something that people worry about with respect to nanotechnology. So there's this whole category of concerns that become, from a methodological point of view, confounding variables when we ask someone in a generic sense what is risk, and we have this nice, neat box of what constitutes risk, but actually people's concerns are much broader and more general than Ted just came here and wrote 20 on the board, so I think that means I've used up 20 of my 20 or 30 minutes. I know I'm supposed to ignore that sort of thing, but I'm easily distracted. So, but that's really the main message that I want to leave people with, is that I think that we have spent enormous amounts of time thinking from an expert point of view what a risk is, and we've asked people about risk and gotten puzzling and contradictory answers. And I think we need to spend an equal amount of time trying to think about what concerns, which may be ethical, they may be what I call social risks, they may involve distributive justice and procedural justice, what other factors outside of health and environmental risks people are associating with any new technology. And specifically in the case of nanotechnology, you know, it's been rather difficult. People at the Woodrow Wilson Center and other activists, well, yeah, they are sort of an activist group. They have a mission to raise awareness of risks and to some extent to encourage appropriate regulation. And it's been rather difficult to get people to pay attention. We expected this huge outpouring of concern that hasn't happened yet, at least for risks in a narrow sense. But what we're seeing